Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Scary stories. I love them. And likely, you're here because you're a fan of them as well. I greatly appreciate a good, true story, but I'm also a fan of old legends, spooky folklore, and a good campfire ghost story. These things are enjoyable to me since, for whatever reason, I like getting scared. It's fun. Sometimes. Context matters, right? Because when something you thought only to be fiction makes its way into your real life, that's not so enjoyable. The fun has been sucked away, leaving you with just fear. I guess all we can hope for with experiences like these is that we'll still be around after our experience to share it with others, like those in tonight's stories. So, let's get started, shall we? This happened a long time ago, back when I was a kid. Whenever my mom and dad would be busy going to work, they would leave me and my younger cousin to my grandma. All things were fine and all, but one day I decided to go to the river at the back of my grandma's house. So I got up and took my younger cousin with me. It was normal at first. We'd actually go almost every time we were there, even when the elders would say, "Don't go there. There are bad spirits, and people have died there." I brushed it off as one of the old wives' tales, until one day, when we went to the river. It was cloudy, and the water was murky, but we stayed nonetheless. Until one of the elders grabbed us and said, "You shouldn't be here when the water is this strong." So she took our hands and started to go back. But before we did, I looked back and I saw it. That thing. It's so clear in my head that I can never forget what I saw. A woman in all white, but her clothes were dirty and torn. She had scratches, and the openings in the skin were just oozing dark liquid. It still shocks me to this day. But fast forward a few years, one night while my uncle was staying with my grandma, they claimed that night something supernatural happened. The smell of dead fish covered the whole room, while parts of the ceiling started to drip blood. All the while, their hair stood as straight as trees. They were freaked out by all of this. So a few days later, my parents went to see them. I saw my cousin, and I proposed that we investigate the place at night, around 7 p.m. to be exact. Thinking back to my old experience, I told my 12-year-old self I could handle whatever happens. So when 7 p.m. struck, we armed ourselves with a flashlight for both of us. My cousin, being the coward that he is, I gave him a simple task to go to the back side of the kitchen and look around, while I went to the far back of the house to try to find something unusual. As I arrived at the back of the house, I asked in a slightly high-pitched voice, "Is anyone there?" Nothing. As I was about to turn back, it breathes. The sound of something so big was right behind me, and it breathed so heavily. I ran. I didn't dare look back, and I yelled for my younger cousin to get back into the house. As we went back in, I explained the story to them, but for some reason, I don't think they believed me. Now, you might not believe me, but I swear, what I heard that day wasn't a figment of my imagination. Just last year, I stayed at my grandma's house with my 2 older sisters and my mom, since her and my dad got divorced. Although I still stayed with my dad since he helped me get through depression. Either way, I was there, and I asked my mom and grandma if anyone died in the river, and they said yes. According to them, there were about 3 women who died in the river. All of them died from the strong currents of the water. As I've asked the townsfolk, I've learned that some of them have had the same experience as me. Woman in the river, all white clothing and bruised. While my father has said that before he arrived in that place, there was actually a cult near the river. And now there's just a lot of odd stuff that's happened. But he wasn't going to go into any details. All I want to know is, what is she and why is she there? This story is about my father and my uncle, who had this experience when they were kids. My father and his elder brother, my uncle, were like best friends from childhood. My father used to live in a joined family in a very small village in Maharashtra state, India. The village is located a bit into the jungle, with a population of hardly 500 to 800 people at this time. Farming was the main occupation, with little to no electricity. Also, a lack of wall clocks, so they used to determine their time according to the daylight. It was around 1966 or so. Now, I know it sounds like medieval times, but it was the situation for tribal people in India. So, my father, then 8 or 10, and my uncle, then 15 or 16 years old, used to get up early in the morning, around 4 a.m., and they would go into the jungle to cut the woods for daily needs like cooking, building, etc. But before that, my aunt, their elder sister, used to make some breakfast for them, like bakri, kind of an Indian bread, and sabji, curry for relevance. She would pack either of them a tiffin so that they could eat later, or used to deliver the food herself in early dawn with my grandfather, who used to start the farm's work. The jungle was near the farms, and my father and uncle used to go to the familiar area of the jungle, the one that my aunt knew very well. She could track them down easily, have their breakfast together, and then come back together with the wood logs. One day, my uncle and father got up early in the morning as usual. It was still dark, and it was winter. Sunrise was a bit later during this season, and their sister was still sleeping, so they decided not to disturb her. They picked up their axes and went for the jungle. That day in the jungle, they decided to go a bit further than usual. But in reality, they went way too far. They were not even able to see the lantern lights of the village. They started cutting a tree and gathering little sticks from around. They got very busy and were concentrating for the time being. After about an hour and a half or so, my uncle got suspicious over why the sun was not rising yet. By this time, there were supposed to be birds singing, and they heard no rooster making that typical morning noise, no cattle mooing, and no dogs barking, which came along with the shepherds. All that they heard was an eerie, deep silence. It was so silent, in fact, that my uncle got worried that they were earlier than their usual time, so he started to hurry up in his work. Now, before going any further, let me be very clear about my uncle. He's a very tough guy. Nothing scares this dude easily, and he's respected by the whole village. Same goes for my father. But this time was different. He didn't know why, but he was feeling like there was something wrong, and that something was watching them from the deep jungle. And he knew better than to think that it was some tiger, cheetah, jaguar, or wild boar. He felt something was wrong that day, and then, all of a sudden, my father and uncle hear the voice of their sister from a long distance away. They couldn't see her. It was just a voice. My uncle got very suspicious, as the voice was coming from deep within the jungle and not from the direction of the village. my uncle told my father to tell her to come to them. So, my father responded to her voice, telling her to come to them. The voice stopped for a moment, and then she replied,
"No, you come to me. Hurry. I've brought you your favorite food."
In that moment, my uncle realized what it was. He'd heard a lot of stories from the villagers of a voice which takes people away, sometimes never to be found again, or, if found, they would be in a horrible mental state. The locals used to call such paranormal entities chakva, meaning the paranormal being who will hypnotically fool you into taking your own life. As soon as my uncle snapped out of his thought, he realized that my father, being a naive kid, had started walking toward the voice and started responding to the entity. It was saying my father's name and yelling,
"Come in this direction. I'm here, waiting with the breakfast."
With full speed, my uncle ran towards my father and grabbed him by his shirt collar, saying, "Don't listen to her. Come on, we must go home." My father responded, "But it's our elder sister. She's calling us. I am hungry." By that time, my uncle had already grabbed my father's hand and told him, "She's bluffing us. She has no food. Now come on." Now, my father was about to start arguing with my uncle, but he looked into my uncle's eyes. He certainly looked scared, and his hand was shaking. Father, too, sensed that something was wrong and started walking fast toward the village without another word.
"Why are you going toward that side? Come here. Follow my voice,"
the entity said. My uncle, still holding my father's hand, "Ignore her. She's not coming to us anyways." Needless to say, he was trying to divert my father's attention from the entity and play it cool so that he wouldn't panic. As they were walking toward the village, it felt like an eternity. Now, being Hindu by religion, my uncle started mumbling mantras of Lord Rama, Hindu god. The voice slowly started to fade away as they were getting closer to the village. My uncle took a long sigh of relief when the dog started barking. All of a sudden, from the direction of the village, they noticed that some of the village lamps were close by. The whole village of dogs gathered together and started barking, making loud crying noises, like wolves. My uncle thought the entity might still be following them. He and my father started running toward the village. When they finally reached it, the voice was long gone, and there was this sense of lightheartedness. My uncle stopped near our ancestral temple, joined his hands, bowed his head, and said, "Thank you." My father was still confused about the situation. Once they reached home, my uncle and father saw that my aunt was still in her bed. My father, being a naive child, cursed her for beating them in the race. My aunt told them that she didn't get up that morning, let alone make the food. It turns out my father and my uncle had left the house way too early, as in 2 a.m. or even earlier. And it was a no-moon night, so it was dark already. My grandfather and uncle knew better than to think that it was my aunt out there. And to this day, they're thankful to God. If you're into true crime shows or channels, you've probably heard this story before, or at least the main details. I've seen it covered in several myself. Here's some context. This happened 11 years ago. I had just turned 18 and moved to Orange County, California. I moved into an apartment complex near the community college I was attending, so a bunch of younger people around my age lived there. I didn't know a single person in California, so I would take any opportunity to socialize and meet new people. A big gathering place at the complex was at the main pool, where people would drink and relax in the sun. Over the first few months, I would meet a bunch of people while hanging out at the pool. I never got super close to any of them, but I would see these same people several days a week. We would often go back to each other's apartments after the pool to drink or smoke some more. It was a really mellow and fun environment. 3 people I would see all of the time were Sarah, Mike, and John. One day after hanging out at the pool, Sarah, my girlfriend, and I went back to my apartment. The 3 of us smoked and Sarah went back home. Regular day. The next day, we were at the pool, and there was a few of the usual people missing, but still a solid 10 people, so we didn't really notice. We go home later that night, and my girlfriend gets a call from one of our friends. My girlfriend playfully answers her phone, and the expression on her face starts to change. She's just listening, and her eyes get super wide. She says, "What the fuck? Are you fucking serious?" and hangs up the phone. I'm super confused, so I ask her, "What? What happened?" She says, "Dude, the police just found Sarah dead in Mike's apartment, and Mike is nowhere to be found." What the fuck? It was insane. I asked her if he said anything else, but she told me he was really hard to understand. We went to bed, and we met up with the usual crowd at the pool the next day, which included John and his fiancée. We're all talking about how unbelievable this is. Sarah was the epitome of sweet, and Mike was easily one of the kindest people I'd ever met. He was one of the first people I met when I moved. He gave my underage ass some beer and told me stories. These were both good people. It didn't make any sense. We all kind of started speculating and just tried to make sense of it. Nobody could get a hold of Mike. We all start to worry if he's safe. Somebody suggests that Mike probably killed Sarah, panicked, and ran. That was a hard pill to swallow for most of us, but it was the only thing that kind of made sense. John shook his head and said, "Man, just awful." We all dispersed and went home. It would be the last time I would see most of those people. Fast forward a month or 2. I was hanging out in my apartment one evening when my girlfriend calls me frantically. "Please come to my friend's apartment. You are not going to believe this shit. This is the most fucked up shit I've ever experienced," she said. I rushed over to the apartment where my girlfriend was. She was with 2 friends that we knew from the pool. One of them was crying hysterically, while the other sat with him. My girlfriend motioned for me to go outside, and the other friend stayed back to keep consoling the other. Once we were out of earshot, she told me why her friend was crying so intensely. Her friend had just gotten back from being with the police. He was asked to identify pieces of a dismembered body that were found in the sewer. He was crying because he positively identified the body parts as Mike's. How did the police know they were there? They knew because John told them that he did it. Turns out John was, and still is, a broke piece of shit. This bastard was engaged and didn't have enough money for his own wedding. Being a goddamn smart person, Mike had a bunch of money saved up. John found out about it and decided to kill Mike and steal his money. John was an acting student and asked Mike to help him move some heavy things at the theater. When Mike's back was turned, John shot him. He then took Mike to another location where he dismembered his body and dumped the remains in the sewer. John took Mike's keys and phone, and then he went back to Mike's apartment. From there, he texted Sarah on Mike's phone, asking for her to come over because he wanted to talk. Being the sweet and caring person she was, Sarah went over to Mike's apartment to help him feel better. When she got there, John snuck up behind her and shot her. He left the apartment and framed Mike for Sarah's murder. John was caught because he's a stupid fucking idiot. He paid some kid to withdraw money from Mike's ATM account. Cops found the kid, and he told them about John. They quickly tracked John down at his fucking bachelor party, and he was taken in for questioning, where he would admit that he murdered Sarah and Mike. He would later be sentenced to death. After sentencing, Mike's dad spoke to John across the courtroom and said, "My only regret is that the state of California doesn't allow me to kill you myself." Turns out, John's fiancée tried to help him hide evidence, and she was sentenced to time as well. All in all, pretty dark story. Aside from the violence, what messes me up is that the guy had literally just murdered 2 of our friends, and he was at the pool, commiserating with us. Like, genuinely acting upset, sad, and confused. He's a horrible human, and I hope he suffers for the rest of his life. My deepest and continued condolences go out to the family of the 2 innocent people that were killed. I've always been a bit skeptical when it comes to the paranormal. I'm not a non-believer. I just have a hard time believing some of the stories I hear, or even videos and pictures I've seen. I have had a few experiences in my life that were, and remain to be, unexplainable to me. So I'd like to share a few of them with you that happened in the same house I was living in over a few years' time, and get your opinions. When I was a child, my mother had to move us out of an abusive household with her boyfriend. Being poor in rural eastern Kentucky, we didn't have many housing options at the time. So she got some assistance to have us a house built on my family's property through the government. This was a fully new place, so it was hardly one that he would assume would be haunted, like one with history. But after it was built and we finally moved in, very unexplainable things began to happen to us while we were there. The first thing that ever happened to me was the attic door being ripped open and slamming shut while I was home alone. My mother and my older sister were taking my younger brother to the doctor, and my uncle lived next door to us, so she let me stay home by myself. The strange thing about it all is that it wasn't a normal door. If it were, I would just assume it was a draft, wind, or something. The opening to our attic was a cutout in the ceiling, though, and the door was a thick, whole piece of plywood, one that I could hardly lift up myself when I went up there. This thing lifted from the side, like it did when we went upstairs, and then slammed shut, followed by loud, thumping footsteps on our stairs. As soon as it lifted, I looked up at it. I could see straight up into the attic, and never saw anyone or anything come down those steps. Not even a shadow. The footsteps stopped at the last step, and then everything went silent, leaving me terrified and wondering what the hell just happened. Second experience was seen by my whole family. I have to explain here that at the time, I was 10, my sister 14, and my little brother was 6, and we were all below 5'5". My mother's only 5'1", so this would have been impossible for any of us to do. Our back door was in our kitchen, and it stood at a height of 6'5", as most standard doors do. The weird thing is that after 6 months of living there, we began to notice a handprint well above the door frame, like someone had slapped it as they walked through. Seeing as none of us could reach it, even standing on a chair, my uncle came to investigate it, telling my mother that it was car grease and oil that the print was made out of. There was no man in our house at the time. My mother was divorced. My father was currently going through cancer treatments and only came to that house 3 times before he died. No one visited that was tall enough to reach that area, as most of the men in my family are 5'7" and under. The last experience I'll tell you about happened when our house unfortunately burned down. As I said before, we were poor, so the only heat that we had was a kerosene heater, and one that sadly was in bad shape. Needless to say, the heater caught fire one evening, catching the rest of the house up quickly. My mother had enough time to grab the 3 of us and get us out of the house, closing the back door behind her as she went. Our steps at that door were not connected to the house, so when someone would walk down them, they would move away and then slam back into the house when you stepped off. Once we were in the yard, though, the back door slammed open and then slammed shut once more, and the steps moved forward as if somebody was on them, and then slammed back against the house. We never saw anyone leave that house. That door opened to an empty, ablaze room and slammed shut again. Those steps moved, but there wasn't anyone on them. And to this day, I still have no idea what the fuck was actually going on in that house. There are way more incidents, but I feel as if these 3 tell the most about the situation. I can't logically figure out what was going on. I've tried over the years, tried to come up with logical explanations for all of the stuff that went on, but I've never been able to. Also, I never felt like I was in danger there, and it never felt evil. It would just scare the bejesus out of you when something happened, that's all. If any of you have a thought on what this could have been, please leave a comment, as I've spent years trying to justify these experiences in my mind. As an adult, in my mid-20s, I was my bestie's babysitter. I babysat her little boy, who at the time was around 1. Not all the time, just for date nights. As social workers, we were overly cautious about who watched our children. As you can imagine, we've heard the worst. So I'm watching H at bedtime. After playing downstairs for a bit, we go upstairs so I can bathe him before bed. We bathe, and then I'm drying him off on the floor, playing peekaboo. I then hear something downstairs, some movement, and their dog starts barking. It's a little yappy dog, and he barks all the time, but this time he wouldn't stop. So then I think, maybe they just came home early, but the dog keeps barking incessantly, not pausing, just going crazy. I'm still drying off H, and so I pick him up, and I hear clear as day downstairs a male yelling,
"Stop barking at that monkey."
The dog instantly stops barking. I then wait because I'm thinking it's my bestie's husband. No one comes upstairs. I then get this feeling that creeps up my spine, and I just realize that it is not my bestie and her husband. They are not home. I start to panic because I'm thinking a stranger has broken into the house. I start looking somewhere to hide H in the bathroom because my cell phone is downstairs and I want him to be safe. I'm so terrified that I'm shaking. I then decide, fuck it, I'm bringing H with me because I think he'll be hurt if I leave him by himself. I pick up H, still wrapped in a towel, and take a deep breath. I'd built up the courage to run downstairs to find my phone, so I open the door, and I run with that baby like I've never ran before. I grab my phone on the counter and then run back upstairs. I text my bestie, who says she'll be home in 20. I search the house. I don't find anything. She comes home. I tell her and her husband what happened. They both look at each other and kind of nod. I'm like, what the fuck? First, they tell me that they call H monkey at bedtime. They both then proceed to tell me how they think the house is haunted, about stuff that happens all the time, like a cigar smoke smell, stuff being moved and disappearing, etc. It had never talked before, though. I was shook. We're still friends to this day, but you bet your ass I did not babysit again. To clarify, this is my mom's story from one of her part-time jobs in the early 90s, so it happened a long time ago. In 1990-91, my mom started working at a group home as a youth worker, doing counseling and support work. For context, this home was in a residential area, not too far from the local hospital, police station, downtown core. This home had 3 floors and had about 8 different girls who lived on the 2nd floor and an attic above. The main floor was where the office and the kitchen area were. At the time, the agency didn't have strict regulations, so my mom would be working night shifts by herself and having to manage all of these kids alone. One night, my mom began her shift and was made aware of some really creepy information. Both the home supervisor and the kids who lived in the home reported weird smells at night, sounds coming from the attic, and food was going missing on day and night shifts. Keeping in mind at the time that nobody was allowed up there or stayed there, my mom would have to do half-hour checks to ensure that all the doors were locked. However, during her shifts, she didn't notice any problems. Thankfully for her, none of the weird events took place on her specific shifts. As events kept being reported, they then called in maintenance workers. When the maintenance workers went around to check the property, they noticed that one of the windows on the 3rd floor, in a room which was locked, had been broken. The room wasn't accessible from the inside of the house, so nobody knew about it. Unfortunately, that room had access to the attic. The maintenance workers then went up to check the attic and found various things: food wrappers, clothing, and even things from the residents' bedrooms. The room was locked off from the inside of the house, but was able to be opened from the other side, from inside the room. Meaning that at some point, throughout night or day shifts, the stowaway was walking inside the home and no one knew. They would have had to have come down when the residents were either being taken to school, asleep, or at appointments. But the stowaway would have been able to view the schedule board in the office. So they would have known when staff were coming and going, and any days when residents would have been gone. During the time that the stowaway had occupied the attic, there were reports from other staff members about feeling as though they were being watched. Eventually, the maintenance workers fixed the windows. The fridge was locked, and security cameras were installed. There weren't any issues after that. However, my mom does have other creepy stories after working 20-plus years in the field, and she just might share some more. Growing up, when I stayed over with my grandparents, while I was supposed to be asleep, I would sneak out of my bed to sit in the hallway, and I would listen to them and their friends play cribbage. It always seemed like such fun. They would have some sort of rapid jazz playing in the background, and I could hear the familiar sound of drinking glasses clinking, followed by roars of laughter. And I think that was my favorite part, hearing my grandparents laugh so much, even if I didn't exactly know what they were laughing about. Eventually, I'd actually get tired and shuffle back to bed, recounting some of their jokes in my head as I drifted off to sleep. Well, about 6 years ago, my 98 and 97-year-old grandparents both passed away, just within a couple of days of one another. They had lived in their home their whole lives, and that's where they passed. My mom kept the house for a little less than a year before deciding to clear it out and sell the place. We were over there for several hours, cleaning and reminiscing as we packed things. Eventually, my mom left, and it was just me. It wasn't until the end of the day, as I cleaned the floors in the hallway, that I felt something. At first, that's all it was, just a feeling that the house was suddenly more lively. As I tried to sort out this feeling, I heard music. It was so quiet, maybe far away, but it sounded familiar. Then the sound of clinking glasses made itself known, and I realized the music I was hearing was jazz. Then the sound of laughter, the most wonderfully familiar laughter. It belonged to my grandparents. I actually dropped the mop and darted out of the hallway and into the dining room kitchen area. The sounds crescendoed slightly before coming to a complete end. The home was quiet and everything was still. You can call it a really vivid memory, but I like to think that somehow they were there with me, even if it was just for a moment. And most importantly, I genuinely feel like they're together wherever they are. Well, friends, that's all the stories we've got this week. But be sure to join me every Friday night for more new stories. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your stories with me and with my wonderful audience. And wonderful audience, thank you so much for listening. If you love The Darkest Hour and you never want it to end, be sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. And check out our subreddit. Follow The Darkest Hour on Instagram at thedarkesthouryt. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me. amandadarkesthour@gmail.com. Stay spooky.